Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to end up in a legal battle with my landlord. I always paid my rent on time, kept my place clean, and tried to be a good neighbor. But sometimes life throws you a curveball, and you have to decide whether to duck or swing back. My story began about 2 years ago when I moved into what seemed like the perfect apartment. It was a modest 2-bedroom in a decent part of town, close to my workplace, and the rent was reasonable, which is saying something in today's market. The building was owned by a property management company that managed several complexes around the city. During the viewing and move-in process, everything seemed professional and straightforward. For the first year, things were great. The property manager, a middle-aged guy I'll call Mr. H, was responsive about maintenance requests, and I had no issues with any of my neighbors. I'm a software developer who works from home most days, so I spend a lot of time in my apartment, but I'm not exactly what you'd call a noisy tenant. I don't play loud music, don't have parties, and don't even own a pet that could cause disturbances. The trouble started about a year into my lease when the owners of the building sold it to a new company. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, just a letter in the mail informing us of the change and providing new contact information for maintenance requests. But within a month, we all received notice that our rent would be increasing by 15% upon lease renewal. This was frustrating, but not entirely unexpected in the current housing market. I did my research and found that while steep, the increase wasn't out of line with what was happening elsewhere in the city. So when my lease came up for renewal 3 months later, I reluctantly signed on for another year. That's when I met the new property manager, a woman I'll call Miss S. From our first interaction, I could tell she was different from Mr. H. Where he had been laid back and reasonable, she was rigid and seemed to view tenants as adversaries rather than customers. "We're implementing some new policies to improve the quality of life in the building," she told me when I picked up my new lease. "All residents need to strictly adhere to the noise restrictions and communal area usage guidelines." I nodded politely, thinking nothing of it at the time. The new policies turned out to be a 5-page addendum to our leases with restrictions on everything from what times you could use the laundry room to how many guests you could have over at once. About a month after my lease renewal, I received my first noise complaint. It came in the form of an official warning letter slipped under my door. "Dear tenant, we have received complaints about excessive noise coming from your unit between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on August 15th. This constitutes a violation of your lease agreement, specifically Section 8.3 regarding quiet hours, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. Please be advised that future violations may result in penalties up to and including eviction. Sincerely, Property Management." I was completely confused. On August 15th, I had gone to bed early with a migraine and taken a sleeping pill. I had been unconscious by 9 p.m. and didn't wake up until my alarm the next morning. There was literally no way I could have been making noise during those hours. I immediately called the management office. "Hi, this is apartment 307. I just received a noise complaint warning, but there must be some mistake. I was asleep during the time mentioned." "We don't make mistakes with our documentation," Miss S responded coldly. "A neighbor reported loud music and voices coming from your unit." "That's impossible," I insisted. "I live alone and I was asleep. Maybe they got the wrong apartment number? Our complaint process is very specific. The tenant clearly identified unit 307. Well, they're mistaken. Is there any way I can talk to them to clear this up? We maintain tenant anonymity for these complaints. Consider this a warning and make sure it doesn't happen again." I hung up, frustrated but figuring it was just a misunderstanding that wouldn't be repeated. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, another warning letter appeared under my door, citing noise violations on a night when I'd been at my parents' house 2 hours away, celebrating my dad's birthday. My apartment had been completely empty. This time, I went down to the office in person, armed with time-stamped photos from my parents' house and a statement from them confirming my whereabouts. "There's been another mistake," I explained, showing Miss S the photos on my phone. "I wasn't even in the apartment on this date. I was at my parents' house." She barely glanced at my evidence. "Photos can be from any time. This doesn't prove anything. My parents are willing to sign a statement. Family testimony isn't reliable evidence." She cut me off. "2 complaints in a month is concerning. Perhaps you should reconsider whether this building is the right fit for your lifestyle." I left the office with an uneasy feeling. Something wasn't right here. Why was she so unwilling to even consider that there might be a mistake? A week later, I ran into my next-door neighbor in the hallway, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for over a decade. "I heard you've been getting noise complaints," she said, looking concerned. "That's surprising. You're the quietest neighbor I've ever had." "You've never heard noise from my apartment?" I asked. "Never. and my bedroom shares a wall with your living room. If anyone would hear noise, it would be me." This confirmed my suspicion that something fishy was going on. I decided to start keeping detailed records of my whereabouts and activities in the apartment, complete with time-stamped photos and videos when possible. The third complaint came exactly 1 month after the first one. This time, I received a final warning letter stating that any further complaints would result in eviction proceedings. The date of the alleged violation was a Tuesday night when I had been working late at my company's office, again, not even home. I tried calling the management company's main office instead of dealing with Miss S, but they just redirected me to her. When I emailed the company, I received a generic response about taking all tenant concerns seriously and saying that my case had been noted. At this point, I was genuinely worried. 3 strikes seemingly meant eviction, according to their warning, and I had already received 3 completely fabricated complaints. I decided I needed to take more proactive measures. First, I set up a basic security camera system in my apartment. Nothing intrusive, just a couple of cameras covering the main living areas that would activate with motion detection. This would give me video evidence that I wasn't hosting wild parties or blasting music. Second, I downloaded a decibel meter app on an old phone and set it up to record sound levels in my apartment continuously. It would timestamp any peaks in volume, giving me data about actual noise levels. Third, I started talking to other tenants in the building. It turned out I wasn't the only one receiving questionable complaints. Several others had similar stories, particularly tenants who had been there longer and were paying below the current market rate. One Saturday morning, I ran into an old friend at the local coffee shop who happened to be a paralegal at a firm specializing in tenant rights. When I told her what was happening, her expression grew serious. "This sounds like constructive eviction," she said. "It's when landlords make living conditions so unbearable that tenants leave voluntarily, allowing them to re-rent at higher rates or avoid proper eviction procedures." "But how do I prove it?" I asked. "Document everything, every interaction, every complaint, and maybe talk to some of the other tenants who've moved out recently, see if they experience similar problems." Armed with this advice, I created an email address specifically for collecting evidence and stories from current and former tenants. I discreetly passed it around to people I trusted in the building and asked them to share it with former residents they kept in touch with. The responses were eye-opening. At least 7 former tenants had moved out after receiving a series of inexplicable noise complaints or other lease violations. Most had been long-term residents paying below market rent. One former tenant even forwarded me a revealing email she had accidentally received from Miss S to the building owner, discussing how they needed to accelerate turnover of legacy tenants to optimize rental income. Meanwhile, my security cameras and sound monitoring were painting a clear picture. During the times of my alleged noise violations, my apartment was either empty or completely quiet. Just as I was compiling all this evidence, the hammer fell. I received a formal eviction notice citing repeated and severe violations of the noise ordinance clauses in the lease agreement. I had 30 days to vacate or face legal proceedings. Instead of packing, I called a tenant rights attorney recommended by my paralegal friend. After reviewing my evidence, he agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, believing we had a strong case against the property management company. "What they're doing is illegal," he explained during our consultation. "Fabricating lease violations to force out tenants is a form of constructive eviction, and in our state, that can lead to significant penalties." We decided on a 2-pronged approach. First, we would vigorously fight the eviction in court. Second, we would file a countersuit against the property management company for harassment, constructive eviction, and violation of tenant rights laws. The day of the eviction hearing arrived. Miss S showed up with a corporate attorney from the property management company, looking confident and smug. That confidence quickly faded as my attorney presented our evidence. 1. Video footage showing my empty apartment during 2 of the alleged noise disturbances. 2. Decibel meter readings showing no unusual noise levels during any of the complaint periods. 3. Witness statements from neighboring tenants confirming they never heard noise from my unit. 4. Documentation showing a pattern of similar complaints against long-term tenants. 5. The accidentally forwarded email discussing the strategy of removing legacy tenants. 6. Statements from former tenants who had been pushed out through similar tactics. The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing at the property management representatives with increasing disapproval. When their attorney tried to argue that my evidence had been manufactured after the fact, the judge wasn't buying it. "Your client has provided no evidence to support these alleged noise violations," the judge noted. "No recordings, no specific descriptions of the noise, not even the names of the complaining neighbors. Meanwhile, the tenant has provided substantial evidence contradicting these claims." By the end of the hearing, not only was the eviction denied, but the judge referred the case to the housing authority for further investigation into the property management company's practices. But we weren't done yet. My attorney proceeded with our countersuit, adding the evidence from the eviction hearing. When the property management company realized how much trouble they could be in, including potential class action exposure if other tenants joined the suit, they suddenly became very interested in settling. Initial settlement discussions went nowhere as they offered insulting amounts like 2 months of free rent. But as the housing authority investigation gained steam and more tenants came forward with similar stories, their tone changed dramatically. After several rounds of negotiation, we reached a settlement that included 1. A 2-year lease renewal with rent frozen at my original rate, before the 15% increase. 2. Compensation equal to 6 months' rent for harassment and emotional distress. 3. Payment of all my legal fees. 4. A written apology. 5. Removal of Miss S from her position as property manager of our building. Additionally, the property management company agreed to review and revise their complaint procedures to require actual evidence before issuing warnings and to provide tenants with the opportunity to respond to complaints before they become part of their rental record. The day after the settlement was finalized, I watched through my window as Miss S cleaned out her office, her face pinched with anger. The corporate office sent a representative to temporarily manage the building until they could hire a replacement. 2 weeks later, we received notice that the property management company had been fined by the housing authority and placed on probation, requiring quarterly reviews of their practices for the next 2 years. Life gradually returned to normal in our building. The new property manager, a younger woman with actual experience in customer service, made efforts to repair relationships with the tenants. The bogus complaint system was replaced with a mediation approach that addressed real issues while protecting everyone's rights. As for me, I'm still here, working from home, enjoying my apartment at my original rental rate for the foreseeable future. The whole experience was stressful and time-consuming, but standing up for myself and helping other tenants in the process made it worthwhile. I've learned that sometimes fighting back isn't just about winning your own battle, it's about changing the system so others don't have to fight the same battle in the future. And while I never wanted to be the person who took their landlord to court, I'm glad I found the courage to stand up against their unfair tactics. Sometimes the little guy really can win against corporate bullies. You just need evidence, persistence, and the willingness to fight for what's right. If my story helps even one other tenant stand up to unfair treatment, then all the stress and effort will have been worth it. And Miss S? I heard she's working at a much smaller property management company now. Hopefully one where she can't harass tenants with fake complaints anymore. Edit. Wow, this really blew up. Thanks for all the supportive comments and questions. I'll try to address the most common ones here. Yes, I did consider moving rather than fighting, but the rental market in my city is brutal right now, and moving costs would have been several $1,000s I didn't have at the time. Several people asked if other tenants were compensated too. The settlement only covered my case, but my attorney is now representing 5 other current and former tenants in similar cases against the company. The housing authority investigation is also ongoing and could result in more widespread remedies. For those asking if this is legal advice, it's not. Every jurisdiction has different tenant laws. If you're facing a similar situation, please consult with a local tenant rights organization or attorney who knows the specific laws in your area. And finally, thanks to those who suggested I buy rather than rent. Trust me, I'm saving up for a down payment, but in my high-cost city, that's still a few years away. Until then, I'm grateful to have secure housing at a reasonable rate. The next one is a malicious compliances story. A little background first. I, now 45M, used to be a military driver in the Dutch Navy a long time ago, and at some point I was stationed at a little Navy base meant for physical rehabilitation of Navy personnel. With little, I mean a base with less than a few hundred people. My function was to drive patients to the military hospital, CMH, to drive groups of people to the swimming pool, etc. When I was at home in the weekends, I would do my workout at my regular gym, but on work days, when finished with my work, I would train in a small gym on site where I was stationed, because I would stay on base during the week. I was about 21 years old, and I was preparing for my very first bodybuilding contest, so I was muscular and working out a lot. At some point, the gym manager, a Marine sergeant, told me that somebody at upper management was offended by my looks, and that I was no longer allowed to wear a tank top during my workout. My tank top was wide-fitting and purely functional, and seemingly nobody was ever bothered by me wearing it. At least that's what I thought. I argued with him about how unfair I thought this was, and pointed towards a fellow gym-goer who was also wearing a tank top, and asked the sergeant why this guy wasn't told to not wear a tank top during his workout. This man was athletic and in a fair shape, but not bulky and muscular. The sergeant, I got along with him very well, agreed with me, but told me that the officers in charge ordered him to tell just me, and orders are orders. He agreed with me though, but higher up already decided, so he felt that he did not have a choice. At that point, I just took my loss and finished my workout. The next day, I found the perfect solution and took one of the shirts we got in our in Dutch PSU, Persoonlijk Standaard Uitrusting, what roughly translates to personal standardized gear. This shirt was a stretchy, slim-fitted white shirt, so I decided to wear that for my next workout. When I arrived to the gym, the sergeant shook his head and told me that this was not what the officers in charge would appreciate, so I told him this was what the Navy gave me, so it cannot be wrong. My body was much more on display compared to the tank top. The tight fit showed everything, especially when I was sweating. I was fully compliant with the dress code, and nobody would be able to dispute that. The sergeant laughed because he knew I was right, but told me the officers probably would be pissed. I kept doing my workout like this during that week, and after the weekend, the sergeant told me with a smile that higher-ups retracted their order and to please start wearing my tank top again. The next one is an entitled parent story. This is a story from a couple months ago that happened to me while working, and oh boy is it a doozy. I work in a local bakery, a sandwich shop, and we once had a couple bring in their baby. Most people will either bring a stroller or just hold their baby while they eat because we don't have any high chairs, but instead of doing that, they spent the entire time, around 20 mins, following the baby around the shop while carrying their plates of food with them, instead of sitting down. The baby was approaching other guest tables as they were eating, and the parents just stood and watched as the people eating were looking at them confused and annoyed. It's important to note that at the time it was only me and 2 other people working. My boss was the only baker, so he was busy making dough, and my other coworker was taking lunch, so the only person who was watching this happen was me. Back to the story, eventually the baby made its way over to the front door, and instead of picking the baby up, the parents opened the door to let the baby crawl outside and towards the road, and only stopped it when it was crawling off the curb into the road. They then proceeded to follow it down the sidewalk out of sight of the windows, all the while still holding and eating their plates of food. That was bad enough, but what happened next was just gross. We have a display filled with merchandise, including a bunch of coffee cups in boxes. After eventually bringing the baby inside, it crawled right up to the display and grabbed one of the boxes. The parents did actually take it from the baby, but instead of putting it back, they carefully opened the box, took the paper padding out of the box, took the cup out, then gave it to the baby, at which point the baby started licking all over the cup and putting it in his mouth. I was genuinely dumbfounded and just watched as the parents proceeded to put the cup back in the box, put the paper back in the box, close the box, and put it back on the display with the rest of the cups. They put an unwashed, dirty, slobbery, baby spit-covered cup back into the box and put it on the shelf for some poor, unsuspecting soul to buy and use. They did not even mention the dirty cup, just silently put it back on the shelf. I immediately told my boss about what I saw, and him being the thoughtful, always seeing the best in people person that he is, could not believe somebody would do something so stupid and unhygienic, asking if I was sure I saw it correctly. That was until he walked over to the front and saw what was happening himself. Some more context. We had a broken espresso machine my boss was trying to fix for use in the bakery. Due to the small size of the building, we didn't have enough counter space for him to work on it in the back, so he opted to use one of the tables in the front of the restaurant as a workbench. Whenever we opened, he just put the espresso machine and tools into a box and set them in the corner against the wall where they were less noticeable, and put a paper note on it saying not to touch it. If you ever opened up an espresso machine, then you know that there are a lot of metal pieces, delicate circuitry, and wires inside, so imagine his surprise when he looks into the dining area to see a baby chewing on some exposed wires of said espresso machine while the parents just watched. He immediately walked over and told them they could not stay if they could not control their child in about the most polite a way possible. To their credit, they did stop the baby from chewing on the wires and apologized. The baby didn't damage it or get hurt, luckily. My boss didn't kick them out because he only saw the baby chewing wires and didn't want to make a scene as they were finishing their food already. I'm sure he regretted that decision when he returned to behind the counter and turned around to see, as both me and him were watching in plain view, the mom take a different cup off the shelf, open it, and give it to the baby, who immediately began licking it again. The look on my boss's face could only be described as a mix of disgust, confusion, and disappointment all at once. My boss didn't even react at first and just watched for what felt like hours, but was in reality only a couple seconds before the mom once again put the cup back in the box and put it back on the shelf. I've never seen my boss look so defeated in his life as that moment. He immediately walked over, took the cup off the shelf, and told them they had to pay for it. The parents both laughed and asked if he was joking, as though we didn't just see a baby treat it like it was a spittoon. They did end up paying for it, but the entire time they were being rung up, the mom kept asking why it was such a big deal while the father just stared daggers at my boss. They left immediately after with no other issues, leaving both me and my boss absolutely bewildered. It was only then that I remembered that that wasn't the only cup the baby was allowed to defile, so I quickly grabbed the box and gave it to my boss, who immediately turned around and tossed it in the garbage without a word. Since then, they have not returned, but we did notice a couple days later that there was a 1-star review posted the same day that simply read, "Not child friendly." Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.